No. We have an interesting topic today, given that we have a box of Timbits up there. Hunger and food security. Clearly, this classroom is quite food secure. So remember, you probably don't remember, but we didn't talk about that in depth, but the MDG goal number 1, which we think was somewhat met, had to do with poverty and hunger. Right? We want to have the proportion of people who suffer from hunger by 2050, and we kind of got close to it. And now the SDGs have tackled that in a new, distinct way, looking at more comprehensive ways of tackling hunger and poverty. And this is how the data have splayed over the last 10, 15 years. We had about 2,000 people per, what's the denominator here? Oh, million, 2,000 million, so 2 billion people living in poverty in 1990, and it's down to at 1 billion. So it's come down tremendously, and that number kind of depends who's reporting it. I've seen a report from anywhere from 750 million all the way to 1 billion. So 836 million sounds about right. Doesn't matter. The point is, there's still a lot of people who are living in poverty, which usually translates to food insecurity as well. So we think that about 200 million children under 5 are underdeveloped, whatever that means. Usually it means insufficient body size for what's expected, and that's probably due to undernutrition. And we think 1 in 10 is severely underweight, etc., etc., etc. It's getting better somewhat. However, the single biggest chunk of such individuals live in India alone. So today we're going to focus a lot on South Asia, in particular in India, because that's where this problem is quite clustered. So, interesting stats. About 7 billion people in the world, closing in on 8. And as we said, about 870 million or 750 million, depending upon whose stat you cite, suffer each day from what we're going to call hunger. But almost 2 billion are obese. That's interesting. So what can you conclude from that disparity? You have 1 billion who are hungry, 2 billion who are obese. Any insights, any observations, any conclusions, any questions you might want to ask the world? No? Really? No questions? Yeah?
Well, it's the fact that we're not necessarily lacking food.
Okay, so it could be an issue of distribution, perhaps. The food is there. Are fat people just overfed? Or they just have too much of a good thing? Yeah?
Sometimes obesity is due to lack of nutritious food rather than quantity.
Exactly. So it's not just about calories, it's about appropriate nutrition. So the simple takeaway from this would be there are the rich and there are the poor. But no, some of these are the poor as well. So there's a Venn diagram here, and the confounder is going to be poverty. But definitely, we seem to have sufficient calories for the world. They're just not necessarily the appropriate calories and not appropriately distributed calories. About a third of all food produced, 1.3 billion tons, is never consumed. What happens to that food? Any ideas? Or why is it not consumed? Yes.
Is this just for food that's consumed by humans?
Interesting insight. Yes. Just for, yeah, you're going to say?
In a lot of Western countries, it's because the food is ugly.
Food is ugly?
Like, not aesthetically pleasing. People would rather buy, like,
Okay.
nice carrots rather than...
I'm sure that's an issue here, yeah. That's not what's happening to 1.3 billion tons of it, though, but that is a factor, a minimal one, though. Any other insights? Yes, madam? Yeah, that's the big thing. This actually goes to waste. It's either lost in transportation or improperly stored. In the case of India, the food basket is in the Punjab in the north, and that feeds the rest of the country to a large extent. For the longest time, the highway system was very poor, and so a lot of that food was lost in transportation. As they invest in infrastructure, that situation improves. But on a global level, we get our bananas from Central America, we get our quinoa from southern part of Central America, we get other fruits and things from Africa, and they all have to be transported around the world. This is the downside of a globalized economy, well, one of the several downsides of a globalized economy. On the one hand, you guys are so young, you probably don't remember a time when only certain fruits and vegetables were in the grocery store at a certain time of the year. Right? Now you get quinoa and avocados and peaches and mangoes anytime you want. That's a relatively new thing. That's the result of a globalized economy. I can get my mangoes from India any time of the year. But that comes at a price, and that price is transportation and loss via transportation as well. But even within a certain country, as I said, there are storage and distribution issues. So all these stats ask more questions than they answer. Do we have enough calories? Yes. Are they used efficiently, those who have them? No, because we have obesity. Is there an issue with simple affordability of food? Not necessarily. There's a transportation issue. So we have several factors at play that are conflating the problem of hunger and poverty. Again, you probably don't remember this because you guys are so young, and 10 years ago you're like, what, fetuses? I don't know. So, but 10 years ago we had a serious food crisis around the world. 2008, 2009, 2010, food riots made the news. Nobody saw this coming. Well, in the 50s and 40s, we thought, hey, one day we'll have too many people and not enough food, and there'll be riots in the streets or people struggling to get hold of a few grains of wheat. But with the advances in biotechnology, food production, increased global wealth, that seemed to be a thing that was never going to happen. But it happened. So in 2008, we have food riots in Haiti and parts of Africa where hundreds and thousands of people were literally saying, there is no food in the stores, where can I get some? And other things started happening. So the global dairy prices increased by 50%. Wheat prices were the highest they'd been in 28 years because prices are coming down. Right now, actually, the price of food is probably the lowest it's ever been in human history. Is that amazing? For a number of reasons. But they went up that year tremendously. And the global price of food rose between those years. Cereal prices and sugar prices. And cereal is not like breakfast cereal. We're talking about, key grains to access. These are probably the most important food sources in the world. I'll skip that graph. So we'll go back to the food crisis in a second because I want you to figure out what happened. See if you can predict it. This is where the hungry people in the world are. Here the stat says 925 million. Like I said, it varies somewhere between 700 million and a billion, depending on who you ask, but it's of that nature. Most of them are clustered in Asia and the Pacific. Right? So you can say, well, the problem is entirely there. Or you can say that this proportion of the world constitutes 60% of all humanity. So in fact, proportionally speaking, it's on par with the rest of the world. So depending if you're looking at absolute versus relative numbers, you may get a different interpretation. But I think in this case, absolute numbers is the appropriate way of looking at it because this is where the hungry people are. So we're going to focus on looking at Asia for the most part today. Yes? Mm-hmm. Literally, it falls off of trucks. Right? Literally, it falls off of trains. Or more likely, it goes bad in transportation. By the time it arrives, a portion of it has spoiled. Or it's stored somewhere and the refrigeration is insufficient. If you go to your grocery store, like almost all that produce is probably wasted at some point. I always buy the stuff that's on sale that day, 50%, which is why I'm sick half the time. So, because usually it's pretty good. But yeah, it's a storage and transportation issue having to do with things falling off and improperly refrigerated. So this stat shows us the number of hungry people over the past 100 years or so. It's been coming down steadily. It went up dramatically around that time of the food crisis, and it's come down again since then. So the takeaway from this graph is, in general, if you have the long view, hunger seems to be an issue that we are addressing efficiently and significantly. On the other hand, there appears to be momentary spikes in events in human history that may throw a wrench into the works. So here are the things that happened during the food crisis, right? I mentioned that we had the highest price in grain, also the highest price in rice in 20 years. We had the lowest supply of wheat in 50 years. Here's a weird thing. So I mentioned that we have a globalized economy. So one of the powers of a globalized economy is our country doesn't have to produce everything. We can rely upon another country to produce the stuff that we need, as long as we produce some of the stuff that they need. And through trade, we can agree that we're going to have, as a society, together all the stuff that we need. As an aside, that's been proposed as a steady state economy. So off on a tangent for a second, many people argue that one of the problems with the world is that we define wealth as growth. in order for a society to be deemed to have a healthy economy, must grow at a certain percentage every year. The Canadian government grows between 1 to 3%, sometimes 5% per year. That's our economic growth model, which is fine. That's actually very healthy for a wealthy nation. India and China, at the peak of their economic explosion in the 90s, were growing at 10%, which is astounding. But growth is what every government seeks to achieve for its economy. Many people say that no, that growth is the problem. If we're always growing, we're always polluting, we're always expending, and there's a finite amount of resources in the world. And so some have suggested for a steady state economy, one way to achieve a steady state requiring no growth but wealth is to have an agreement where people agree to only make certain products. So if the two of us are the only two nations in the world and the nations need Fizbits and grommets, whatever those are, I'll agree to only make Fizbits and you agree to only make grommets, and that way I will trade my Fizbits for your grommets, and I will never make grommetses, so you will always have a standard price for your grommetses. You will never make Fizbitses, so that's how that works. And we kind of have that in some capacity. So Canada, we think of ourselves as a great wheat producer, but we're actually not the world leader in wheat production. The world leaders are actually in India, believe it or not, and in the Soviet states like Kazakhstan and Russia. So during the global food crisis of 2009, there was such fear that certain nations wouldn't have enough food that they closed their exports. So Kazakhstan suddenly said, you know what, we're not exporting any more of our wheat because we're afraid that our people might need it, so no more wheat supplies. That put a shoe in the works for the entire world. So suddenly, one of the players in this agreement of exchange is not doing their bits. I'm picking on Kazakhstan as an example, but several countries were doing this. So quickly you see how, with a little bit of stress on the system, key agreements fall apart and the entire system starts to fall apart as well. What happened then was speculators were sensing food shortages. In fact, we think that speculators may have started the whole thing. Given that food production and pretty much almost all of human economy is tied to the marketplace, once you start speculating, meaning I'm going to bet that the price is going to come up or down, suddenly that changes the actual price. Right? And speculation has been, people suggest, has been the cause of economic collapses at a very large scale several times in the recent history. Someone leaving already? Because you know I'm going to mock you. I'm sorry. The price you pay for leaving is you will be mocked. Now he's got diarrhea and I feel bad. You know? Not as bad as he feels, probably. So speculation again is when, hey, I think this price is going to go down, so I'm going to buy up all the shares, and that pushes the price up now, and so now suddenly some people can't afford it. So speculation changes the natural pricing of commodities, and that throws the entire system out of whack. So that's kind of what happened in 2009. Speculators started the system rolling, and it got out of control, and prices came out of whack. Then we had things like climate change were confounding issues as well. So now with climate change, we can't predict with the same amount of certainty the amount of produce in a given harvesting year. We'll go over this in greater detail when we have the climate change lecture. And then we have at the same time the credit crisis, so also called the subprime mortgage crisis. Again, I keep forgetting how young you guys are. You guys were, again, 9 years old this was happening. This was global news. The great economic collapse of the time was due to the fact that, the mortgage system in the U.S. had collapsed, and that had a domino effect on pricing around the world. As a result, the agencies that traditionally help out struggling nations didn't have enough money to come to their aid. So a series of bad factors came to play together, and that created a global crisis where poverty was, in the short term, really incensed. Okay, that was a short-term events that happened in 2008, 2009. As I mentioned, those are like, I showed you that curve of hunger going down, then we have the spike. Factors that we can't predict cause these kinds of spikes. But there are some other long-term global factors that we kind of can predict, and one of them is people living on arable land. So historically, human beings have done the wise thing, which is we live on the crappy land. We live on the rocks and the tree roots and things like that, and then we reserve every square centimeter of soil for growing food. That changed in the last 100, 200 years or so, and really accelerated in the last few decades. If I think about where I grew up in Toronto, Markham when I was a kid was cornfields, right? And you go there and you catch wild animals in the cornfields, and now it's all strip malls, and that's insane. So we've paved over some of the best arable land in the world to build strip malls because it is economically more advantageous for the owners of that land to sell it to developers than it is to develop it as agricultural land. That's a flaw in our economic system, is the pricing flaw. And some governments have stepped in to say, we're going to prevent people from selling arable land unless it's being sold for people to actually grow on it. But the other side saying you cannot compel people to sell for certain purposes. If they own it, they can do what they want. But that's the trend that's happening here, is that we have a historical trend now of living on arable land, which is kind of crazy given that we have less and less arable land every year due to climate change and sea levels rising and desertification. Then we have this increasing price of oil. So oil is another great confounder in predicting the history of the world. If you believe in peak oil, as many people do, peak oil says that there's a certain finite amount of oil in the ground and we've passed the peak of how much we can extract from it, and we're kind of like living off the dregs right now, and at a certain point we're going to run out, and we don't know what's going to happen after that. So if that's the case, then oil is getting more expensive because it's getting rarer, and if it's getting more expensive, that means cost of transporting products. What products? Well, food. What food? Well, wheat. Mostly wheat and rice grains around the world. That's also going up. So these are two things that really we don't have a whole lot of control over right now. As population increases and as oil prices increase, that's going to affect the availability and the pricing of food. Agriculture has a particularly important role in economic development. So historically poor societies can get themselves out of poverty relatively quickly by relying upon agriculture as the base of their economic expansion. However, agriculture as the base of your economy has a ceiling regarding how much wealth you can actually produce. It's a bit counterintuitive. So if you have a nation with a lot of land, great, we'll grow cattle, we'll grow wheat, we'll export it, and that'll be the basis of our wealth. But you can only get that wealthy. Our economy, our wealth is based on what? We talked about this already. What's Canadian wealth based on? Services, thank you, right? We think of ourselves as a food-producing nation. We're not really, because our image is the grain fields of Saskatchewan and all that stuff. And that's part of it, but that's not the big part of it. Our big part of it is services, mining, and natural resources. Right? So we're a wealthy nation for those reasons. We're like a non-impoverished nation because of agriculture. Well, as we're going to see in a bit, the nations for whom a large percentage of their GDP, of their wealth, is based on agriculture tend to be the poorest nations. And that has to do for a number of reasons. One of them is, well, they got themselves out of absolute poverty by investing in agriculture, but then agriculture as a base of their wealth is not something that you can grow upon quite dramatically. Right. So, but it has a role to play. And this graph, a little hard to understand, but what it's saying here is, as you expend more money on developing an industry, which industries give you the biggest economic bang for your buck? Agriculture gives you less bang for your buck the more you rely on it. Non-agriculture gives you more bang for your buck the more you rely on it. That's what that's saying. Okay, put that in the back of your mind. Now let's move our focus to South Asia. By South Asia, by the way, that's a colonial term. Invented by the British, that we kind of still call it this. I don't know why we call it South Asia still, but we're talking India, all the brown places essentially, all of which used to be India, but then post-colonially it was broken up into these other nations. Okay, so all the stuff you see on this map is South Asia. Look at this graph. This shows us the percentage of the world's poor who live in Asia in which countries they live. So in 1990, 38% of the world's poor live in China, 24% in India, 8% in the rest of Asia. Then, 15 years later, only 15% lived in China and 32% lived in India. So both of these countries went through an economic miracle in that period. Both became the great economic tigers of the region. Both are regional superpowers. Both now have space programs and nuclear weapons and super high-tech industries and a lot of billionaires. So they're both unparalleled to be very similar. And yet, China has fewer of the world's poor. India has more of the world's poor. What happened there? Any ideas? Yes.
Like China did a lot more of just like rules with everything.
I'm sorry, I said.
Just rules in general. They're more strict with like how many kids you can have.
Okay, so domestic population control. Maybe, yeah.
I think maybe because India's economy was more based on agriculture.
Could be. That's actually pretty insightful. That's. I'm sure it played a role. Look what happened in the rest of Asia. Their share of the world's poor went up dramatically. So in fact, India and the rest of Asia, their share went up dramatically. China's share went down. There it is, back there.
Is it because that in China or in India, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer?
Interesting. Both countries, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So what's actually happening here, and it's not obvious, is movement of people. More poor people moved into India. Fewer poor people moved into China. And part of that has to do with the nature of those societies in general, how welcoming they are to immigrants. Part of it has to do with the cultural similarities to the neighboring nations. And part of it has to do with what their economy and wealth is based upon. I was kind of alluded to over there. So the Chinese economy is based largely upon manufacturing. The Indian economy is based upon manufacturing and services still, so the call centers and all that stuff. So it's kind of easier to, if you're a poor person, to migrate to India and be absorbed into this call center economy than it is to migrate to China and be absorbed into this manufacturing economy, considering the manufacturing is still sequestered in the eastern coast. And you've got also the great linguistic barriers and ethnic barriers in China too. So again, a variety of factors played into how people were moving within Asia. But that's what's happening, we think. Okay? At the same time, both countries invested heavily in anti-poverty controls, and both were somewhat successful. This shows us, again, where these people are. Not a whole lot to take out of the slide, except that most of the world's poor live in India and China, mostly India, and the remaining bunch live in other middle-income countries like Pakistan and Nigeria, and a quarter live in other low-income countries. Yes, Sheridan?
Do they import food, or is the majority of their food from
I don't know. I think they produce it mostly, but I'm not entirely certain. Okay, here is India again. So this research institute, the International Food Policy Research Institute, believes that in 20 years, India will increase its demand for meat by almost 200%. For a largely Hindu, i.e. vegetarian society, that's a lot. Milk and vegetables by 70% and grain by 27%. Why will India increase its demand for these products? The population is growing, but not that fast. Back there.
I was going to say about the immigration, as you mentioned earlier, of the new population.
The population isn't growing by 176%. So no, it's not. That's not what's happening. I'll tell you a story of the great empty cities of India and China. Have I told you about the empty cities before? You should go to YouTube and look up Chinese empty cities. It's fascinating. So we have satellite footage, spy satellite footage of these 22nd century cities in China that are adjacent to these ancient cities. And these new cities, though, are empty. Nobody lives there. They've got harbors, opera houses, hotels, every imaginable infrastructural amenity you can imagine, but the only people there, occasionally you see like a military car goes by or something like that. Now, the Chinese government says that these cities exist because they're replacing the crumbling cities next door, and eventually people have to move over once they get the right income stream and all that shit. That's possibly not the reason for it. India has a similar empty city issue. So outside of Delhi, there's a place called Gurgaon. I don't know if you've ever been there. If you drive north from Delhi to Agra, beautiful 12-lane highways. And on either side, there are these incredible 21st century cities. There's an F1 Formula 1 racetrack in one of them. I've seen, it's incredible. Mostly empty. Now, both governments have different reasons for having empty cities. I wonder if you can guess why these cities are there, what their purpose is. The answer to the Indian city will answer the question of why their desire for these things is increasing. Who's going to live in those cities in India? Aliens? Sorry? The elite. Not quite the elite, almost the elite. So, who's been to India? All right, you've been to India. Fantastic. Describe Delhi for me. Who lives in Delhi? It's kind of dirty, but it's also something else.
In terms of what? Like,
I don't know. It surprised me.
there are areas that are really like poor and there are areas that are
Really rich. Okay, and here.
Big chunk of the middle class as well.
Big chunk of the middle class. So, I was there a while ago, and we rented a condo in Delhi just for the stay, and it cost more than a condo in New York would have cost. That's how crazy expensive things are. So there is a growing middle class. That's what we're talking about here. An incredibly exploding middle class that is so distinct from the elite and distinct from the lower class that they are a specialized demographic unto themselves. This is the IT crowd. To some extent, the call center crowd. Young, mostly male, individuals who have Western lifestyles like us, but they're Indian. They're Indian born and bred, and they're staying in India. And they eat like us. So these new cities in the north of Delhi, in UP, are made with the assumption that this middle class is moving in. And you know what? They are moving in. It's actually working. And I'm not sure where the water is coming from. That's a mystery to me. But this is to large part, they're a Hindu population, but that's okay because economics trumps religion. Right? The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to have a Western lifestyle, regardless of what your religious dictates seem to suggest. Now, the Chinese empty cities are another story entirely. As I mentioned, they're there to replace the old cities, but there might be something else going on there entirely, because I mentioned the Chinese economy grows by 10%. That's a difficult thing to maintain. One of the easiest ways to maintain a 10% growth is to expend your foreign reserve on construction. So if you're a Chinese governor with orders from central administration to maintain economic growth, best things to do is, hey, I'm just going to build shit. Keep on building cities, and that gives me the illusion of economic growth. Maybe that's what's happening. But it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? Go to YouTube, empty cities, look it up. Okay. India is the world's second biggest producer of wheat. Believe it or not. I'm not sure why I mentioned that. Okay. But the global supply of grains and cereals have actually decreased. So we have increasing demand, decreasing supply. Technology is assisting us in increasing actual yield, and maybe biotechnology will assist us in increasing the preservation of certain kinds of crops as well. But these are all things to watch. So let's look at how we're going to measure the quality of a population's hunger and poverty. Some of these you looked at already, but I'll suggest to you that these 6 indicators are important for looking at the quality of a population's ability to sustain itself food-wise. The first is the percentage of GDP dedicated to producing crops. As I mentioned, agriculture is a great way to kickstart an economy from absolute poverty into something resembling sustenance. But if a large percent of your economy is based on agriculture, that's not good for the long run. It means you're probably not going to be one of the truly wealthy nations of the world unless you change that. From a historical perspective, after the Indian independence in the 40s, India was a strong agrarian economy. Their wealth was based on agriculture. But the new government was following the Soviet model and wanted to make them into an industrial economy. And they struggled for a bit, right? So that's why the Indian economy was stagnant for several decades until the IMF came in and turned them into an export economy. The point is, they understood they couldn't remain an agrarian economy if they wanted to be a power in the 20th and 21st century. They did what they could to get out of that agrarian model. The next is HDI. So we talked about HDI briefly, the Human Development Index. It's a composite score going from 0 to 1 that looks at things like health, education, and standard of living. And, I mentioned the Scandinavian countries and New Zealand and Canada usually rank at the very top. South Asian nations, somewhere in the middle, and sub-Saharan African countries usually near the bottom. So we look at that as one of the indicators of wealth and poverty too. Next, the percentage of underweight kids under 5. That's very self-evident. The proportion of the population that is undernourished. Now, hopefully you're thinking, how do we operationalize undernourishment? Do we actually go door to door and weigh people and pinch their fat and No, we don't actually, right? We look at things probably like BMI, right? Or maybe do like overall national surveys. Then there's this thing called the GHI, which we'll talk about next. This is the Global Hunger Index. This is a composite score as well, based on 4 components. We'll go over that in a second. And the higher the number, the worse the situation. For here, HDI, the higher the better. Here, the higher the worse. It can go well into the hundreds. And lastly, the infant mortality rate. So this is the number of kids that are dying per 1,000 live births. So we talked about these two in the past, how these are essentially easy measurements of population health. Every society seeks to protect their extremely young and their pregnant women, and if they can't do these two, then something's really wrong. And these are the ones that are most associated with food. So you haven't got the slide in your deck, so here's your chance to take notes. So the 4 components of the GHI. Undernourishment, as I mentioned, so it's kind of included in here, in this one, right? But we do it again. Child wasting, so a portion of children that are low weight for what's expected. Child stunting, so that's how big they are they of sufficient height, and how much they are dying. There's a lot of overlap in these indicators. And this is how it's computed. Now you need to know that we take these 4 dimensions, we compute an index for them, we add them all up and give them a weight, and that gives us the GHI score. So you see that this one, right, those dying before the age of 5, is worth a lot more than the other ones. So how do we interpret that? If it is less than 10, we say things are probably manageable, they're okay. If it's 10 to 20, we say that it's moderate hunger. If it's 20 to 35, serious hunger. 35 to 50, alarming hunger. Anything more than 50, well, something really bad's happening. Yes, I know this slide is not in your deck as well, because I'm being mean. Okay. Yeah. Now, we only compute the GHI for countries that we think are going to suffer from poverty. Canada, we don't compute it for. The USA, we don't compute it for. Essentially, Western European nations, we don't do it for, because what's the point? It'll be such a small number, it won't be a blip on our graphs. But for other countries, we definitely try to make sure it's under 10. So, here are some winners and losers in terms of GHI over this 20-year period or so. So, Kuwait had dramatic improvement in GHI from 1990 to 2008, whereas the Congo had a huge decline in the quality of their hunger. What do you think is happening there? Look at the dates. What happened in Kuwait from 1990 to 2008? Yeah. Oil was always in Kuwait, but something else important happened in these dates in Kuwait. Yes, I know it's before you were born, but it's recent history. No one knows what happened in Kuwait in 1990? It affected everybody. All right, what's happened in the Congo in the last 20 years? Yeah? Civil war. So what do you think happened in Kuwait? So it was not a civil war. What kind of war was it? Ever heard of the first Gulf War? Oh, these people. So the first Gulf War happened in 1990. It ended rather quickly. So when 1990, things were really, really bad because the Iraqis had invaded and the Americans, the NATO, and the Canadians showed up as well. So it was an enormous war in Kuwait that Canada was involved in. Shameful, people. Shameful. And when that was over, things got better because we invested heavily in the rebuilding of Kuwait. Right? So whereas the Congo, the war sustained itself. The takeaway from here, of course, is that war is bad for hunger. Simple message. Again, here are more GHI stats. The worst country in the world in terms of GHI is the Congo, and the African nations in general aren't doing that great. Okay, same kind of stats. Okay, so let's look at how these indicators play out for South Asian nations. First, look at Canada. I mentioned that Canada does not compute a GHI, so I went to Saudi Arabia instead. So Saudi Arabia is probably the other wealthier nation for which we do compute a GHI. And for them, it's less than 5. It's minuscule. But Canada, 2% of our GDP is based on agriculture because we are a services-based economy. we rely very little on agriculture for our wealth. Very high HDI. This data is from, I don't know, 2010 or something, so we've come down a bit. But in general, we're close to being perfect in HDI terms. Minuscule number of kids underweight. Minuscule percentage of hungry people, believe it or not. Our GHI, not even worth talking about, and our mortality rate for infants is quite low. We have this basement of about 5. It never gets below 5 for some weird reason. Now, the other countries show this. I won't go over each of them in turn, but there's some takeaways here. India is, again, the local superpower, but yet 60% of its GDP is based on agriculture, and that's not good. That's alarming. That suggests that they need more innovations and interventions and programs to drag agrarian workers into the 21st century. Otherwise, they are destined for multi-generational poverty. HDI, not bad. It's not one, but it's not bad. Very large percentage of underweight kids, an unhealthy percentage of people who are starving, and this GHI, which is, let's go back to our scale again. Which does that say? 24. That's serious hunger. It's not alarming yet, but it's serious. Okay. Now let's look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka actually only has 12% of its GDP based in agricultural. And this data was from, again, a few years ago. So things have changed since then. And their HDI is quite high, but their GHI is still not very healthy. So Sri Lanka has many of the characteristics on its face of a higher income country. And yet it is a struggling nation when it comes to some of these key demographics here. High HDI, right? Low percentage of GDP based on agriculture. So those two alone suggest that there's something fundamentally good about Sri Lanka in terms of its ability to be wealthy, and yet it's struggling with hunger issues. Why do you think that is? What is special about Sri Lanka in the past 20 years or so that has given them some issues? You're looking at me so nervously. You want to guess, don't you? You want to say it, don't you? There was a war, exactly. Well, you don't know the answer, it's probably war. Okay, so the Sri Lankan Civil War ended 2, 3, 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. But until then, that threw them into chaos. They have all the markers for success and wealth, but a war ruined everything. Okay, let's transition now talking about food security. We've heard that term. Food security is this, according to Wikipedia. So it's not just, is there food? It's, can you have access to the food? So you are food secure when you do not live in hunger or fear of hunger. There are 3 pillars of food security. The first is availability. So is there food in your community that's there? Second is, do you have access to that food? And third, do you know how to use it appropriately? So think about there's the Metro grocery store down the street. That's great. So clearly we are food secure. There is a wealth of food down there. Now think about the homeless guy living next to that grocery store. Is he food secure? No, he isn't. Because the food is available, he just can't access it because he has no money, or they won't even let him through the front door because he's not dressed appropriately. Okay? Or maybe you get, how many undergrad students do I know who can't cook? Right? All look at each other. So maybe you've got money and you can get to the grocery store, but what do you do with the food when you have it? You know? I don't know how to use a can opener. Good joke, by the way. So a mathematician, an engineer, and a physicist are all locked in individual cells. Why? Why not? And in those cells, there are cans of food, but no can opener. And you leave them there, and you come back a month later, or 2 months later, and the physicist is dead. The engineer is a bloody mess, but he's managed to get 1 can open. He's barely alive, he's skin and bones. The mathematician, also skin and bones, not a bloody mess, he's alive, and he's holding a can that says, assume this were open. That's a joke. I didn't say it's a funny joke, it's a joke. It's a math joke. Jeez, you people. So the food was available. He didn't have access to it, but did he know? I don't know, whatever, I'll move on. Okay. They can't all be winners. Okay, so here are the questions we ask ourselves when we're thinking about food security around the world. First, if there's enough food in the world? Clearly there's enough food in the world, so clearly the problem is how do we get it to everybody? Or there may be food now, but maybe there won't be enough food in 50 years. Right? So we think about in 2070 there will be about 12 billion people living on the planet, and we think in order to feed those people we'd have to increase food production by about 70% likely, unless we make other changes like everyone goes vegan or something like that. Right? The third question we ask ourselves is maybe food security is the most important thing we should think about as a nation. Protect our food sources, don't export anymore like Kazakhstan did. Or maybe we should not think about it at all because we can buy it from other people. Right? So the two opposing viewpoints here. Maybe globalization is going to lead to always having food insecurity issues. Why? Because the Bolivian farmers will always have to grow quinoa, and as a result, they can never afford anything more complicated. Or it's the cause of our salvation because we'll always be able to buy quinoa. So the facts can be argued for both sides of the argument. And I'm not telling you which is true. I'm saying this is the argument. And that's the maze we must navigate intellectually. When we think about sustainable food systems, there are several components that we have to think about. I won't go through these in depth. I'm just planting the idea in case you want to develop it further. But environmental sustainability, of course, is becoming more and more paramount in how we think about this. When we talk about climate change, we'll see why. We'll see crops are at their extreme tolerance now of climatic change, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have the extent to which human health is invested in food production. For example, genetically modified foods. Do people think they're safe? Yes or no? Are they an appropriate investment? Economic vitality. How much do we want to rely upon our agricultural sector to produce food versus wealth? Because the two can be separate. Coffee, for example, produces wealth, doesn't feed you. Okay. And we have to talk about gender, because gender interplays with all of these factors. So women manage the household economics for most homes around the world, but they do not manage the cash for most of those homes. So they're relied upon to actually acquire the food for the household and to cook the food, etc., and distribute it, but they cannot control how much resources they have to do that job. So there's a disconnect there as well. Here's some interesting quotes. This is from this one paper here, that if women were given the same access to resources, i.e. Money, and we increase women's education, then we could reduce the rate of child malnutrition. Why? How does empowering women affect child malnutrition? Same thing here. UNICEF says the low status of women and their lack of knowledge are important determinants of high prevalence of underweight children. Well, it's right there, isn't it? It's knowledge. So if we invest in female education, then the women who are the leaders of the economic aspect of the household can then make better decisions for that household. So one could argue that it's a disempowering statement, saying that their only value is in how they contribute to the welfare of children. On the other hand, it's an undeniable truth that if they are accepted as the leaders of the economic household, then improving their ability to appropriately disperse those resources can only render positive outcomes within the household. Let's go through an example now. Think of a household in Bangladesh. So there are 5 people in this household, mother, father, 3 adult kids, all working, which is common. And they're making about $1 a day, so the global poverty line from 10 years ago. So that household is making $5 a day. How are those $5 dispersed? We think that the energy for the household, energy are things like cooking mostly, sometimes heating, that's 50 cents of those $5. Food is the bulk of it, $3 worth. And everything else is $1.50. So that includes clothing and books and education and medicine, even rent. So when we have rent speculation, property speculation, which happens a lot around the world, that's why property values we watch very, very carefully, because it affects human suffering quite profoundly. This can spike easily, draining this quickly. Or if someone gets sick, right? The medicine budget is that gets drowned out easily. Where does the additional money come from? You know, it's funny. I remember, off on a tangent, there's a book called Sharp's Rifles. It's about riflemen in Napoleonic War in the 18th century in England. And there's one episode, one segment where the riflemen are sent to guard a gold shipment from the Dutch to the British to fund their wars. And someone asks the rifleman, who's a working class man, says, "What do you do when you haven't got enough money?" And his answer is, "You do without." But the answer the guy was asking for is, no, you borrow it. You borrow it. Because rich people borrow, poor people do with that. So here, they can't borrow. So this becomes the buffer. The food budget becomes the buffer to account for things that can't have buffers. In the event of personal emergency, it's the food budget that suffers, not the energy budget. So if things like the global prices of oil or rent go up, then things you cannot spend money on are food and medical expenses. And that, of course, leads to poor health. This is a health class, so we have to focus on health. Right, so that's how it all interrelates. So what can be done? All kinds of strategic policy documents out there, and here's one of them. So we have to invest in human resources, meaning improve the human capacity to manage food and maybe to make more money. Improve food security for selected target groups like Aboriginals or forest-dwelling people, maximize participation of women, all that great stuff. This is the IFPRC's recommendations for South Asia, for India. I won't go through all these, but a couple of things I want to look at here. First is biofuel policies. What is biofuel? Who knows what biofuel is? I love when I look around, people like look down right away. Yes, ma'am. It's not cow dung, but yes, close. What, if not cow dung, then what? Because we're talking here about food. Well, we're talking here about food, so we're not eating cow dung or human dung. Food, it's fuel from food. So you can actually run your car on your cooking oil, I don't know if you know that. It's a Mythbusters episode that shows you can do that. It'll damage your car, but you can do it. So corn is the most common source of biofuel. You can buy gas made from corn now. It's actually it's an entire small industry you can do. India has set aside hundreds of acres of land to grow crops specifically to turn into gas. So can you think of the effects that has on hunger? If I'm growing corn for fuel, walk me through the impact that has on hunger. I'll give you a hint. It's bad. If I'm putting my corn in my car, where am I not putting my corn? The price of fuel goes up? Price of food goes up, exactly. So two things happen. One, the price of corn now goes up because corn is worth a lot more on the market. Second is, if I'm putting corn in my car, I'm not putting it in my mouth. So suddenly there's less food to be eaten. So in general, we think that biofuel is bad for human hunger. It's good locally and short term for economics. It's just bad long term for food. So we've seen this in real time, how the second that biofuel goes to market, certain agricultural commodities spike in price. Yeah. Okay, where does hunger come from? Some obvious stuff. Poverty causes hunger. If you can't afford to buy food, then you'll have no food. Next, economic systems, harmful economic systems. What does that mean? Well, if you don't have a job, then you're going to be impoverished. If the economic system has pushed the manufacturing jobs from your neighborhood to Mexico or someplace, as the Trump supporters always complain about, then that's going to affect your hunger as well. And they're not wrong. Their jobs have gone away, but for reasons beyond the government's control to a large extent. Conflict, we mentioned this already. So we looked at Kuwait and Congo and Sri Lanka. So conflict can cause hunger and poverty. But it's cyclical and circular. Hunger also causes poverty. So if you cannot eat, then you have no energy to function in your job. You cannot get a job. So it's a vicious cycle. And as I mentioned, climate change is the great confounder here that we'll talk about more in the future. And sadly, this will be the thing that affects the rest of your lives. It's probably the most important thing that you need to think about for the rest of your lives. And I think you need to accept that soon. I say you because I'll be dead, so it's your issue. So micronutrients. We can't talk about global health and hunger unless we talk about micronutrients. So micronutrients are trace elements, vitamins and minerals, that we think are critical for health, that many populations have a hard time having access to. And there are all kinds of programs and interventions geared towards micronutrient initiatives. In fact, you can type in micronutrient initiative and all kinds of NGOs will pop up. I used to have a micronutrient specialist come and lecture to this group. But there are essentially three biggest micronutrients that we talk about. The first is vitamin A. And vitamin A, well, second is iron, and the third is iodine. Vitamin A is important for vision, and also for growth of children. Iron is important for anemia, and iodine for thyroid and for mental health. Anybody ever heard of the iron fish? It's a famous Canadian story. So a lot of parts of the world have problems getting enough iron. A lot of young women have problems getting enough iron. Right? You can take iron supplements. An easy way to get iron into your body is to actually cook an iron pot, because the iron actually flakes off as you cook it, and you can then ingest it. It's not as straightforward as you might think, because the bioavailability of the iron tends to waver. So one of the ways that we have attempted to alleviate people's iron deficiencies is to flood the market with iron sprinkles. Stanley Zlotkin in Toronto actually got the Governor General's Award after a lifetime of advocating for the spread of iron filings. So what we do is you package these bits of iron, flood parts of South Asia with it. So every village, every meal that someone makes, they put this packet of iron filings in the curry, whatever it is, and over time the entire family eats it, and they get their iron that way. Or you can put like a chunk of iron that you have in your household into the pot every time you cook, and bits of it flake off. The problem that some societies had is it's weird, right? And it's hard to sell it to someone saying, you got to put this hunk of metal in your food. Like, oh, I don't want to do that. So there's this Guelph student named Christopher Charles who went to Cambodia, where they had a particular problem with putting the chunk of metal in their pot. And he says, well, why don't we just make it look better? So he invented the lucky iron fish. And the lucky iron fish is associated with this community's mythology and their culture. And they revere the lucky fish. So he says, well, just make a lucky fish out of iron. And they did that, and everyone loves the lucky fish. And every house in that community uses the lucky fish, and he has saved their lives by inventing a fucking metal fish. Right? So he is a global health superstar. He's a grad student in Guelph because he invented a fish made of iron, and that's what it looks like. And this guy. So Alfred Summer was an ophthalmologist, and he first proposed that, I think all this night blindness we're seeing in certain parts of the world, that's a vitamin deficiency. People are like, no, you're stupid. It's actually people are staring at the sun too long. No, I think it's vitamin deficiency. And he collected some data. He says, I think it is. And he was laughed out of meetings left and right. He presented at WHO, people staring at the sun. He had to invest his own money into running clinical trials. And he said he not only did he prevent blindness in children by giving them vitamin A shots, he actually cured people who were already blind. And it took years for people to come around and believe him, to the point where now we think that large dose vitamin A capsules actually reduce child mortality by 34% in some societies. So the slowness of the community of scientists to accept Sommer's revelations probably caused a lot of death. He could have prevented hundreds, if not thousands, of more deaths if people acted on his data faster. But he's a hero, right? So he goes down the annals as much like our Iron Fish fellow, as someone who ended up saving a lot of lives for his persistency and creativity. So takeaway message from today. Food security has three components: access, availability, and use. I'll say we'll talk more about Amartya Sen in the future. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he always argues that hunger is not a food problem. Hunger is a money problem. So, and he's talking about the access issue. He says plenty of food, as we saw 1.3 billion being wasted. The problem is most people who are poor or most people who are starving just don't have enough money to access it. Right? So he got the Nobel Prize for that. It seems pretty straightforward. Right? And use. So three components of food security. We talked about the GHI. higher the worst. And we said how we arrange our economics, our market orientation, globalization versus local economies, shutting down exports, etc., and climate change are affecting the situation. And the obvious link between food and health, we talked about that a bit. And lastly, household economics, meaning that how we manage the money that we spend within the house matters. That is all, my friends. See you Tuesday.